Next section, an age of reform. So most reformers at this time, the people who are doing the reforming, were very intelligent, very idealistic, and very much motivated by faith. So we know the Second Great Awakening and this reform movement really went hand in hand. They were connected. And they wanted to perfect society. They wanted to be free from war, free from cruelty, free from drunkenness, discrimination, free from slavery in some parts. And this reform movement gave an excuse for middle-class women to really enter the public arena for the first time. Because remember, the cult of domesticity, they're all about being in charge of the morality of their families. So now this reform movement really gives them a chance to step up to the plate, so to speak, of public affairs. And they gave a bunch of examples of different reform movements that were happening at this time. They were trying to reform prisons, especially debtors' prisons, prisons that, you could be thrown into prison in some cases for owing less than $1. Gradually state legislation started to abolish the idea of debtors' prisons, but it was really a bad deal because really hundreds of people were like languishing in these horrible conditions just because they owed money. So that was a reform. They were trying to get rid of debtors' prisons. In general, criminal codes were softened, meaning the punishment for crimes were less violent, we should say. Because remember before, you could get whipped, branded for some instances. But really, now that's reforming. They're kind of being softer, so to speak, with some of these crimes. And, the number of capital offenses was going down, or the number of crimes that had the death penalty as a result were going down. And they started to see prisons more of a place to reform people as opposed to a place just to punish them. So we get the idea of penitentiaries, the base of that word meaning to do penance for your crime, penitentiary penance. The idea is we should reform prisoners, not just lock them up. Another kind of reform effort was placed behind treating those with mental illnesses. At this time in America, mental illness wasn't recognized as an illness, but they thought these people were being willfully perverse, or like they were doing this on purpose. They were mentally ill on purpose. And they would be chained sometimes, kept in jails or poorhouses, debtors' prisons, just right along with sane people. So being chained in a prison, not perhaps the most humane way to treat the mentally ill. Dorothea Dix is a big name of American history, and she was really the one who reformed the kind of America's view on the mentally ill. She traveled some 60,000 miles across country, going from kind of asylum to asylum, just collecting firsthand observations of how these people were treated. And really, due to her work, the conditions for the mentally ill really dramatically increased. And the idea changed from these people are kind of being willfully perverse to saying, no, these people are actually ill. There's actually mental illness. So Dorothea Dix really did wonders in regards to that. Also, there was another reform movement, just kind of general Americans for peace, against war. So in 1828, American for Peace Society was formed, and that was kind of a war on war. But that didn't last very long because we get the Crimean War breaking out in Europe and the American Civil War, both of which not quite peaceful as they would perhaps hope them to be. All right. Next section, Demon Rum, the Old Deluder. Okay, so this whole section is going to be talking about alcohol. All right, why not? So at this time, it was a problem. It really was. It was the custom, and it's kind of because of, this is why people drank. One, it was custom. People grew up with parents who drank, so they drank. Just kind of the monotony of life, and the fact that, life was tough at this time. really kind of led to excessive drinking. It was a hard, monotonous life. If you're in the factory, very monotonous. If you're on the frontier, very hard life. And all of those things kind of combined really led to excessive drinking. And this was true not of just men, but of women too, of the clergy, of Congress. Really was a problem all across the board in society, just this excessive drinking. They said a lot of times funerals and weddings ended up with drunken fighting, not good. And especially this becomes more dangerous, this excessive drinking, when you're working in a factory, you're around dangerous machinery, you want to be, you don't want to be drunk and working at a factory. You'll probably lose a hand or something to that effect. And it really did, it harmed the family life as well. So there's kind of two approaches of how do we solve this drinking issue. One was temperance, being, drink less, and the other was more or less kind of eliminate drinking completely. So we'll talk about the first one. The people who thought we should just have people drink less. That was kind of the hub of that was the American Temperance Society. In 1826, it was formed in Boston, and they did a couple of different things to help, expand the temperance movement. They had people sign temperance pledges. They had kids clubs called the Cold Water Army. They had a lot of times they had lecturers who had been reformed drinkers. They had pamphlets. Also, there's T.S. Arthur. T.S. Arthur was an author, and he wrote a book called 10 Nights in a Barroom and What I Saw There. And this book, more or less, it's a novel talking about how this once happy village was ruined when the tavern opened. So just kind of that idea of the temperance movement in literature and in society in general. It was happening. Okay, so on the flip side, besides temperance, another way you can kind of deal with alcohol is to get rid of it completely. So that would be prohibition. So temperance is drinking it prudently, and then prohibition is saying, hey, alcohol should be illegal. We shouldn't have this temptation about. So the guy who's kind of the father of this prohibition, or getting rid of alcohol completely, is Neil Dow. Neil Dow is from Maine, and he owned a factory, and he lost a lot of money because his workers would come in drunk and not able to work as effectively as they could have if they're sober. So he lost a lot of money because of these drunken employees, and he actually got a law passed called the Maine, from the state of Maine, right? The Maine Law of 1851, which prohibited the manufacture, yes, that's a word, and sale of intoxicating liquor. Okay, so more or less a kind of a step towards just getting rid of it. So you couldn't make it, you couldn't sell it in Maine. And within the next 5 years or so, about a dozen other northern states passed similar prohibition laws. But the thing is, these laws weren't really enforced, and a lot of them got repealed sooner than later. So there was a movement, though, to get rid of alcohol completely. And although, a lot of these laws weren't enforced, and a lot of the laws were later repealed, still, before the Civil War, there was some good kind of movements forward with this. In general, women drank less because of this movement, and there was kind of less consumption of the hard liquor because of this movement as well. So, they're making some movement forward. All right. Wrong page. Where am I going? All right, next section. Women in Revolt. Okay. If I haven't said this enough, but the cult of domesticity, remember, at this time was very much that women's role was within the house, within the family. That's where they belonged. They needed to be subordinate both to God and to their husband. And legally, husbands were allowed to beat their wives as long as they used a reasonable instrument. Don't beat her with an axe. That's not cool. You can beat her with a belt. That's fine. Not very exciting. And still, women, once they married, they couldn't retain property. So say I have a house and I get married, that title to my house is now in my husband's name. So if we were to divorce or to separate, I wouldn't have claim to that at all. It's now his. So that was still happening. But at least, women were better off in America than they were in Europe. In Europe, they kind of gave an example that rape was only lightly punished in Europe, but in America, it was still one of those crimes that you could get the death penalty for. So, kind of just emphasizing that at least it was better here in America than in Europe, but still not quite there yet. Um, because we have this new market economy starting, gender roles really start to form, right? So it's the men who go out to the factory and work or go out to the fields and make these cash crops, and then the women kind of, their sphere of influence is now in the home. So it was really the market economy that really separated the gender roles. Before, they were working together on the farm, just making a living, but now that factories are coming about, the men work at the factories, the women stay at home, or the men work growing those cash crops and the women stay at home. So really gender roles start because of this market economy. Women were seen as physically and emotionally weak, but they were also, they really thought that their strengths then were in morality and in kind of the artistic refinement. So women, while they were weak emotionally and physically, were strong when it came to morals and also artistically refined in general, right? So on the flip side, men were seen as strong guys, but also very crude. They thought men would more or less become beastly if they did not have their gentle, artistically refined, moral wife then to guide them along the good path. But yeah, still, a lot of women felt like they were in a gilded cage, okay? So they had a good place within the home, but they felt stuck there. So the women's movement kind of started, and the women's movement really started kind of intertwined with a lot of other reform movements. So there was a women's movement, but a lot of times it was connected to perhaps prohibition or to abolition, at least at first. Some of the big names, some of the big names within the women's movement specifically, Lucretia Mott, she was a Quaker, and she had gone over to London to attend an anti-slavery convention and was quite upset when the members of the convention refused to recognize her and the women she brought with them, because they're like, well, you're women, you don't count. She was mad. She made some waves. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, she was a mother of 7, but she was pretty fierce. When in her marriage vows, she actually took out the word obey from her marriage vows, and she was a huge advocate of women's suffrage, the right for women to vote, their sort of more or less their influence in America. Okay, whatever. Anyway, we'll keep going. Susan B. Anthony was she was single, and she was good friends with Elizabeth Stanton. But Susan B. Anthony was really the one who was able to go out. Remember, Stanton had 7 kids. She was pretty busy. But Anthony was really kind of the voice of the movement. She was a militant lecturer. She was often swore at, often the target of garbage. Like literally people would throw rotten garbage at her. But she was the most kind of well-known because she was able to go out and give all these lectures. And so much so that progressive women everywhere, or women who are wanting to not necessarily get the vote, but more of a voice or more of a stance in government, they were called Susie B's after Susan B. Anthony. That's how popular Susan B. Anthony was. So those 3 were really kind of the big names in the women's movement. Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony. Those were kind of the big names. But also the section talks about some kind of, they are making tracks. There are some people kind of making waves in other ways. So we have our first female doctor, our first female graduate of a medical school. That was Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell. We have Margaret Fuller. She was an editor of The Dial. We have a pair of sisters, the Grimke sisters, and they were very prominent in the anti-slavery movement. Amelia Bloomer was the first one to introduce women wearing pants. So what she would do is she more or less had these pants and then wore a shorter skirt over them. And her name, Amelia Bloomer, is where we get to the phrase bloomers, which are kind of pants. So she was, ooh, she's wearing pants. She must be crazy. There's a picture of that on 353 if you want to see what I'm talking about. And Lucy Stone, she was so audacious as to keep her maiden name after she married. So those, 4 or 5 examples I just gave you were just more examples of how people are taking concrete steps towards, kind of equality of the sexes, sort of speak, at least politically, sure, socially, whatever. A big event that happened in the women's movement was the Women's Rights Convention at Seneca Falls. So at Seneca Falls, this happened in 1848 in New York, and it really launched kind of the modern women's movement. The press, as well as the pulpit or preachers, really condemned this. They thought this was a horrible thing. But it was a meeting of women like Susan B. Anthony, that sort of thing, together more or less to kind of organize themselves into kind of like a national voice. However, like I said, a lot of times women's movement was interconnected with other reform movements like temperance, abolition of slavery, and that sort of thing. So really, unfortunately, or more whatever, before the Civil War, the women's movement was really kind of put on the back burner to focus on abolition. So a lot of women who are working with abolition said, hey, we kind of have to pick our battles here. We have to kind of focus our attention. So they kind of took the focus away from women's movement or from the women's rights movement and really to allow them to focus on abolition, on getting rid of slavery. All right, but there was still some progression forward. Some states like Mississippi actually allowed women to retain property after marriage, and more women were actually being admitted to college. So there was some progression there as well. All right, next section, wilderness utopias. So a utopia is, of course, the idea of having a perfect society, or at least a perfect society within a society. So this section more or less talks about 4 different communities, or these utopian communities that kind of sprang up in America at this time. Like I said, these utopian communities, there are at least 40 of them that sprung up at this time, but we'll just talk about 4 briefly. There's the New Harmony community, and this is one of the first ones. A Scottish textile manufacturer named Robert Owen of Indiana set up shop with about 1,000 folks. So there's 1,000 people living in this community. It attracted some hard workers, but also attracted some radicals, some scoundrels. That's a fun word. And also just like people who weren't really, didn't like to work so much. And because of this, it failed. So they did have some hard workers, but there's a lot of people kind of in it, living the easy life. And because of that, it failed. Okay, we have Brook Farm. It's another utopian community. This one was a farm. It was in Massachusetts. They had about 200 acres they farmed. It started with 20 people at first, and they were really committed to the ideals of transcendentalism. Wow, that took a while to say. They were really committed to that ideal at first, but unfortunately one of their main buildings burnt down, and financially they went into so much debt they had to kind of more or less disperse. So Brook Farm was a farm, but it didn't really work because they had a fire, and it went away. All right, that was exciting. Okay. The Oneida community was, your book talks about that quite a bit actually. It was kind of interesting, a little bit crazy. This started in 1848 in New York. They believed that they should share everything, including sexual partners. So more or less, this idea of free love meant that no one was actually married. They just kind of slept with whoever they wanted to. But only the best people were allowed to have the babies. So they'd be like, oh, this guy is smart and strong. We should make him have a baby with this woman who's pretty and has all these good qualities. So that's kind of crazy. So because of that, they did practice birth control. It lasted about 30 years, and the reason it lasted wasn't because of these sexual practices, but really they made these really good steel traps that were very profitable for them, and also they made wonderful silverware, which is still around today. You could probably not Walmart, because Walmart's Walmart, but you could go online and buy some Oneida silverware even today. So that was kind of crazy. Wonderful. Okay, so kind of the opposite end of the spectrum, we have the Shakers. The Shakers, once again, a utopian community, was founded in England, but eventually made its way to America. It was brought here by Mother Ann Lee. It was also in New York, upstate New York. By 1840, it had 6,000 people. But the idea was the Shakers, they made a lot of furniture, that sort of thing, but they were not allowed to marry. And because of that, they didn't naturally reproduce more Shakers. So it was like once, the only reason Shakers grew is if they recruited more. So really, more or less, it was extinct by 1940. But it's kind of interesting because this time in America, there was a lot of optimism, a lot of like, we can do anything sort of spirit going around. And it was really an example of that was these different utopian communities that kind of sprung up. All right, next section. Here we go. The dawn of scientific achievement. Okay, this section is maybe mislabeled because there wasn't a lot of scientific achievement happening in America. There were some, but in general, we are not a world leader in science at this time by any stretch of the imagination. We were really more interested in practical matters, not like not making new scientific discoveries. We just wanted to make life easier, more practical. Okay, so we there's a lot of inventions, a lot of gadgets going around, but we weren't really pursuing science for the sake of scientific knowledge. They list probably 5 different guys who did stuff. I'm not expecting you to know those, but just kind of a flavor of what we were kind of working at. We were improving navigation, making use of learning about the winds and the currents, using those observations to make better navigation stuff. There are some guys that work with chemistry, with biology, with geology. We are publishing some books on plants, publishing some books on the birds of America. Who doesn't want to read that? But really, it was all about, it was more like we were more progressive with inventions and practical things like building a sewing machine, building a textile machine, building a butter plow. That's really where our emphasis was. But there was some folks that were notable in the regards of the scientific realm. But medicine specifically was so primitive, very bad. I would be dead. I would be dead. I would have died a long time ago if I lived back then. So that the practice of bleeding, literally cutting the artery and like letting blood flow, that was still practiced. Of course, that usually led to infection, if anything. Smallpox plagues were still all over the place. They give an example in 1793 in Philadelphia. Several thousand people died during a yellow fever epidemic. People were just like constantly sick, constantly ill. The life expectancy was only 40 years old if you're white, obviously lower if you're not. People often had like really painful teeth problems, and you wouldn't really go to the dentist. What you go to the blacksmith, and he was usually the strong, buff guy in the community, and he would pull those teeth out for you. So not fun at all. And the new medicines they were creating at this time were often more harmful than helpful. You could go and buy, worm-destroying lozenges. I'm not saying that word right. Lozenges? I don't know. But like just these kind of, they'd have these home remedies where you'd, rub a tumor with some toads and that'll help. Just these really primitive, like not very helpful medicines. And of course, surgical operations were not exciting because they didn't have any like painkillers at this time. So literally, if you had to have surgery of any extent, you'd be tied down, given a couple shots of whiskey, and they would just start cutting off your leg or whatever it is they needed to do. Fortunately, by 1860, some people were starting to use laughing gas, kind of to help ease the pain. But I would give up. I'm like, no, no, no. I'm keeping my leg. It'll kill me, but you're not cutting off my leg. That's crazy. Anyway, not that you need to know that. I think that is enough for this video.